The dust from the unmarked grave still clung to Theresa Hartwell's black mourning dress when she walked into the general store in Evanston, Wyoming Territory, that scorching afternoon in July of 1878, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and eyes that had seen too much death in too short a time. She moved through the aisles like a ghost, her fingers trailing over sacks of flour and tins of beans without really seeing them. The shopkeeper, a round woman with concerned eyes, watched her carefully as if afraid she might collapse at any moment. Theresa supposed she looked like she might. 3 weeks of fever had taken her father, mother, and younger brother in succession, leaving her alone on a homestead that felt more like a graveyard than a home. She had sold what little remained to pay for their burials and a stage-coach ticket to anywhere that was not there. "Can I help you find something, dear?" the shopkeeper asked gently. Theresa opened her mouth to respond but found her throat too tight. She shook her head and turned toward the door, suddenly desperate for air that did not smell like sympathy and pity. The bell above the entrance chimed as she pushed outside, stumbling slightly on the wooden walkway. Strong hands caught her elbows, steadying her. "Easy there." She looked up into the face of a man perhaps 5 or 6 years her senior, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of new denim. He wore a dusty hat pushed back on dark hair, and concern creased his brow as he helped her find her footing. A tin star was pinned to his vest, catching the harsh afternoon light. "Thank you," Theresa managed, her voice rough from disuse and unshed tears. "You all right, miss?" He did not release her arms immediately, as if worried she might fall again. "I am fine," she lied, though they both knew it for what it was. He studied her face for a long moment, then seemed to make a decision. "You look like you could use some water and a place to sit in the shade. Come on." Theresa knew she should protest, should maintain some semblance of propriety, but the heat and grief had worn her resistance down to nothing. She let him guide her to a bench outside the sheriff's office, where he disappeared inside and returned with a dipper of cool water from a bucket. She drank gratefully, some of the fog lifting from her mind. "Thank you, Deputy Marshal, actually, Dalton Nichols." He sat beside her, removing his hat and wiping the sweat from his brow with a kerchief. "But most folks just call me Dalton. Theresa Hartwell." She handed the dipper back to him. "You new to Evanston, Miss Hartwell?" she nodded, staring at the dusty street where a wagon rolled past, its wheels creaking in the summer heat. "I arrived on the stage this morning. I had thought, I do not know what I thought, that perhaps a new place might feel less empty than the old one." Dalton was quiet for a moment, letting a group of cowboys on horseback pass before he spoke. "Running from something or to something. From, I suppose." Theresa found herself talking, the words spilling out like water from a broken dam. "My family had a homestead in Nebraska. Fever came through in June. Within 3 weeks they were all gone. Papa first, then Mama, then my brother Samuel. He was only 14. Her voice cracked on the last word. "I am sorry," Dalton said, and she could hear the genuine sympathy in his voice rather than the hollow condolences she had grown accustomed to receiving. "I sold everything. I could not stay in that house, could not walk those fields where Papa used to sing while he worked, could not cook in Mama's kitchen, could not look at Samuel's empty bed one more time." She pressed her palm against her eyes, willing herself not to cry in front of this stranger. "I thought distance might help, but I brought it all with me anyway. The grief, the loneliness, the feeling that I am the only person left in the world." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest in a way that surprised even Theresa. She had not spoken to anyone about what she felt, not really, and now here she was pouring her heart out to a deputy marshal she had known for all of 10 minutes. "I have lost everyone," she said quietly. the admission feeling both terrible and necessary. Dalton shifted on the bench, and when she dared to glance at him, his expression was thoughtful rather than pitying. "You have not lost me." Theresa blinked, caught off guard by the simple declaration. "I beg your pardon. You have not lost me," he repeated, meeting her eyes steadily. "I know we just met, and I know I am a stranger to you, but you are in my town now, and that means you are not alone. I would not be much of a lawman if I did not look out for folks who needed looking after." Something in her chest, something that had felt frozen solid since Samuel's last labored breath, began to thaw just slightly. "You do not even know me. I know you have been through hell and you are still standing. That tells me plenty." He stood, settling his hat back on his head. "When was the last time you ate something?" Theresa tried to remember and could not. "Yesterday, I think, on the stage. That settles it then. Come on." He offered his hand to help her up. "I cannot impose," she protested weakly. "It is not imposing if I am offering. There is a decent boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Crawford. She is a good sort, feeds her boarders well, and her rooms are clean. I will walk you over and make introductions." When Theresa hesitated, he added, "Please, let someone help you, Miss Hartwell. You have been carrying this alone long enough." Perhaps it was the heat, or the exhaustion, or the kindness in his voice, but Theresa found herself taking his hand and letting him pull her to her feet. Her legs felt steadier now, though she still felt hollowed out inside. They walked together down the main street of Evanston, Dalton nodding to various townspeople as they passed. A few gave Theresa curious glances, but no one stared rudely. The boarding house turned out to be a 2-story building painted white with blue shutters, remarkably well-maintained compared to some of the rougher establishments they had passed. Mrs. Crawford proved to be a stern-looking woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. But her eyes softened when Dalton explained that Theresa needed a room and had recently suffered a loss. "I have a small room on the 2nd floor, faces east so it catches the morning light," Mrs. Crawford said, looking Theresa over with the practiced eye of someone used to sizing up potential boarders. "Meals included, wash water brought up morning and evening, $3 a week in advance." Theresa reached into her satchel for her small coin purse, counting out the money carefully. She had enough to last perhaps 2 months if she was frugal, long enough to find work of some kind. Mrs. Crawford pocketed the coins and produced a key from the ring at her waist. "Follow me, Miss Hartwell. I will show you to your room." The room was indeed small, but clean and simply furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, a small dresser, and a wooden chair. A faded quilt covered the bed and white curtains hung at the window. After 3 weeks of sleeping in her family's empty house and then a cramped stagecoach, it looked like paradise. "Supper is at 6 sharp," Mrs. Crawford informed her. "If you miss it, you do not eat unless you make other arrangements. I do not run a restaurant at all hours." "I understand." "Thank you." Mrs. Crawford's expression softened slightly. "Dalton is a good man. If he vouched for you, that is good enough for me. You look like you could use some rest. I will have my girl bring up some water so you can wash up before supper." When the landlady had gone, Theresa set her satchel on the bed and moved to the window. She could see down into the street, watch the flow of people and horses and wagons. The town hummed with life, so different from the silent homestead she had fled. She pressed her forehead against the glass, letting herself feel the weight of everything that had happened. A soft knock came at the door, and a young woman, perhaps 16 or 17, appeared with a pitcher of water and a basin. "Mrs. Crawford sent me up, miss. I am Jenny." "Thank you, Jenny." Theresa watched as the girl set the basin on the washstand and poured the water carefully. "Will you be needing anything else? There are towels in the bottom drawer there." "No, this is perfect." Jenny bobbed a little curtsy and left, her footsteps light on the stairs. Theresa locked the door behind her and began to wash away the dust of travel, the ritual of it soothing despite the ache in her chest. She changed into her other dress, only slightly less worn than the first, and took down her honey blonde hair to brush it out before pinning it back up. By the time 6 o'clock arrived, she felt more human, though no less sad. The dining room proved to be a large space with 3 long tables, already filling with boarders when Theresa descended. Mrs. Crawford waved her toward a seat near the end of one table, between a gray-haired man who introduced himself as a railroad surveyor, and a young couple who kept mostly to themselves. The food was simple but plentiful, beef stew with thick slices of bread and butter, and Theresa found herself hungrier than she had realized once she started eating. The other boarders made polite conversation around her, and she was grateful that no one pressed her for her story. She was helping clear the plates, having offered to assist since she had nothing else to do, when Dalton appeared in the doorway. He had cleaned up since the afternoon, his shirt fresher and his dark hair damp as if recently washed. "Evening, Mrs. Crawford," he greeted the landlady. "I was hoping I might speak with Miss Hartwell for a moment if she is available." Mrs. Crawford looked at Theresa with a raised eyebrow, and Theresa nodded. "Of course." They stepped out onto the front porch where the evening air had finally started to cool. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Dalton leaned against the railing, his posture relaxed but his eyes serious. "I wanted to check on you," he said. "Make sure you were settling in all right." "I am. The room is lovely and Mrs. Crawford seems very kind despite her stern demeanor." "She is all bark and no bite, mostly." He smiled, then grew more serious. "I also wanted to apologize if I overstepped this afternoon. I have a tendency to try to fix things, and I realized later that maybe you did not need fixing, just a listening ear." Theresa considered this, surprised by his thoughtfulness. "You did not overstep. I needed help whether I wanted to admit it or not. Thank you for that." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as a rider trotted past on a paint horse. Somewhere down the street, a piano played badly, probably from one of the saloons. "What brought you to Evanston?" Theresa asked. "To be a deputy marshal, I mean." "Well, I grew up in Texas, on a cattle ranch outside of San Antonio. My father raised beef cattle, and I was expected to follow in his footsteps." He shifted his weight, crossing his arms. "But I wanted something different. I joined up with the Army for a spell, then worked as a scout, and eventually found my way into law enforcement. Turned out I had a knack for it. Do you miss Texas?" "Sometimes. I miss my mother's cooking and the sound of the cows lowing at dawn. But I do not miss the expectations, the feeling that my whole life was already mapped out before I had any say in it." He glanced at her. "What about you? What did you do before you lost your family?" "I helped run the homestead. Cooked, cleaned, tended the garden, helped with the chickens. Mama taught me to sew, so I would take in mending from neighbors sometimes to earn a little extra." She wrapped her arms around herself against the evening chill. "I suppose I will need to find work of some kind. I have enough money for perhaps 2 months, but after that." "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Honestly, I will take whatever I can find. I can cook, clean, sew. I am a hard worker and I learn quickly." Dalton nodded thoughtfully. "I might know of something. The school teacher, Miss Perry, has been looking for help. Her health is not what it used to be, and she mentioned needing an assistant to help with the younger students and maintain the schoolhouse. It would not pay much, but it would be steady work. I would be grateful for an introduction. I will arrange it." He pushed off from the railing. "In the meantime, try to get some rest. You look exhausted, if you do not mind me saying so." "I do not mind. I am exhausted." She offered him a small smile, the first genuine one she had managed in weeks. "Thank you again, Dalton, for everything. You are welcome, Theresa." The way he said her name, gentle and careful, made something flutter in her chest. "Good night. Good night." She watched him walk down the street until the gathering darkness obscured his figure, then went back inside. Mrs. Crawford was in the front parlor, knitting by lamplight, and she looked up as Theresa passed. "He is a good man, that one," the landlady said without preamble. "Yes, he seems to be. Lost his wife 2 years back. Childbirth took her and the baby both." Mrs. Crawford's needles clicked steadily. "He does not talk about it much, but I have seen the way grief marks a person. He knows what it is like to lose everything important." Theresa's heart clenched at this information. "That is terrible." It was. "Nearly broke him from what I heard." But he picked himself back up, kept going, kept helping people. Some folks let tragedy make them bitter. Others let it make them kinder. He chose the latter. She glanced up from her knitting. "I am telling you this because I saw the way he looked at you today, and I saw the way you looked back. Just thought you should know what you might be getting into." "We only just met," Theresa protested, feeling her cheeks warm. "Sometimes that is all it takes. A moment of recognition, one soul seeing another." Mrs. Crawford returned her attention to her knitting. "Just keep it in mind, dear." Theresa climbed the stairs to her room, her mind swirling with this new information. She prepared for bed mechanically, braiding her hair and changing into her nightgown. The bed was more comfortable than she expected, and despite her churning thoughts, exhaustion pulled her under almost as soon as her head hit the pillow. She dreamed of her family that night, as she had every night since they died. But this time, instead of watching them slip away from her, she dreamed of her father smiling and telling her it was all right to keep living. She woke with tears on her cheeks, but a strange lightness in her chest. The next morning, Theresa rose with the sun and dressed carefully. She went down to breakfast, which proved to be Jonna cakes and bacon, and ate while listening to the other boarders discuss the weather and the railroad expansion. After helping Mrs. Crawford clear the breakfast dishes, she asked if there was anything else she could do to help around the boarding house. "I have already paid for my room and board," she explained, "but I am not used to sitting idle. If there is mending to be done or vegetables to be prepared, I would be happy to help." Mrs. Crawford regarded her for a long moment, then nodded. "I could use a hand with the washing today if you are offering. Jenny does her best, but she is small and we have a full house right now." They spent the morning hauling water and scrubbing linens, hanging them on lines strung in the yard behind the boarding house. It was hard physical work, but Theresa welcomed it. Keeping busy meant less time to think, less time to feel the gaping hole where her family used to be. She was pegging up a sheet when Dalton appeared at the back gate, his hat in his hands. "Morning, ladies." "Marshal," Mrs. Crawford greeted him. "If you are looking for Miss Hartwell, she is making herself useful." "So I see." He smiled at Theresa. "I spoke with Miss Perry. She would like to meet you this afternoon if you are available. The schoolhouse is just down past the church." Theresa's hand stilled on the sheet. "This afternoon would be perfect, thank you. I can walk you over if you like, say around 2 o'clock. That would be very kind." He settled his hat back on his head, gave them both a nod, and disappeared back through the gate. Mrs. Crawford made a knowing sound in her throat but said nothing, for which Theresa was grateful. At 2 o'clock, freshly washed and dressed in her better morning dress, Theresa met Dalton in front of the boarding house. They walked together through the afternoon heat, passing the church with its white steeple and the general store where they had first met. "Miss Perry is particular about things," Dalton warned as they approached a small building that served as the schoolhouse. "But she has a good heart. She taught me to read when I first came to town, actually. I had learned some as a boy, but my education had gaps. You came to town as a student. No, I was 23 and already working as a deputy, but she saw me struggling to read a wanted poster one day and insisted on giving me lessons. He smiled at the memory, said it was a disgrace that a lawman could not read properly. The schoolhouse was a simple structure, one room with windows on either side and a small bell tower. Inside, a woman in her 60s sat at a desk, her gray hair pulled back severely. She looked up as they entered, her sharp eyes taking in everything about Theresa in one glance. "Miss Perry, this is Miss Theresa Hartwell," Dalton introduced them. "Miss Hartwell, Miss Alice Perry." "Thank you, Marshal, you may leave us." Miss Perry's voice was crisp and no nonsense. Dalton gave Theresa an encouraging smile and left, the door closing softly behind him. Miss Perry gestured to a chair in front of her desk, and Theresa sat, folding her hands in her lap. "Marshal Nichols tells me you are recently arrived in Evanston and looking for work." "Yes, madam. I am willing to work hard and I learn quickly." "What is your education?" "My mother taught me to read, write, and do figures. I can sew, cook, and manage a household. I have helped teach Sunday school back in Nebraska, so I have some experience with children." Miss Perry opened a drawer and produced a book, sliding it across the desk. "Read to me." Theresa opened the volume, a collection of poems by John Greenleaf Whittier, and began to read aloud. Her voice was steady despite her nervousness, and she made it through 2 stanzas before Miss Perry held up a hand. "That will do." The older woman leaned back in her chair. "Marshal Nichols also mentioned that you have recently suffered a loss. I do not mean to be indelicate, but I need to know that you are capable of fulfilling your duties. This position requires consistency and reliability." "I lost my family to fever 3 weeks ago," Theresa said quietly. "My parents and my younger brother. I will not pretend that I am not grieving because I am. But I am also capable of doing my work. I kept our homestead running for 2 weeks while nursing all 3 of them, and I kept it running for another week after they were gone while I settled their affairs. Grief has not made me incapable, Miss Perry. It has made me stronger." Something shifted in Miss Perry's stern expression, a softening around the eyes. "I lost my sister to fever when I was your age, 22, 23 as of last month. I was 24 when my sister died. I know what you are going through, the emptiness of it." She stood, moving to the window to look out at the empty schoolyard. "The position pays $15 a month. You would assist with teaching the younger children their letters and numbers, help maintain the schoolhouse, and prepare materials for lessons. School is not in session during July and August, but there is still work to be done preparing for the fall term. Can you start tomorrow?" Relief flooded through Theresa. "Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Miss Perry." "Do not thank me yet. I am a demanding employer, Miss Hartwell. I expect punctuality and dedication. You will have both." Miss Perry turned from the window and extended her hand. Theresa shook it, noting the strength in the older woman's grip. 8 o'clock sharp tomorrow morning," Miss Perry said. "Do not be late." Theresa left the schoolhouse feeling lighter than she had in weeks. Employment meant security, meant she could stay in Evanston and build something resembling a life. Dalton was waiting outside, leaning against the building's wall in the shade. "Well," he asked, pushing off from the wall, "I start tomorrow." She could not quite keep the smile from her face. "That is wonderful." His answering grin was warm and genuine. "Miss Perry does not suffer fools, so if she hired you, it means she thinks you are capable." They started walking back toward the boarding house, falling into step easily. The afternoon sun beat down, but a breeze had picked up, making the heat more bearable. "I owe you thanks again," Theresa said. "You have done so much for me and you barely know me. Maybe I would like to know you better." The words were casual, but when she glanced at him, his expression was serious. "If you are amenable to that." Theresa's heart did a strange skip in her chest. "I think I might be amenable. Would you take supper with me tomorrow evening? There is a place that serves a decent steak. Not fancy, but good food." She knew she should probably say no, should maintain proper morning behavior, should not even consider courting when her family had been dead less than a month. But there was something about Dalton that made her want to say yes, want to grasp at the possibility of connection and life continuing. "I would like that," she heard herself say. His smile could have lit up the whole territory. 6:30 then. I will come by the boarding house to collect you." They reached Mrs. Crawford's establishment, and Dalton tipped his hat to her before heading back toward the sheriff's office. Theresa went inside, her cheeks flushed and her stomach full of butterflies. Mrs. Crawford took one look at her face and smiled knowingly but mercifully said nothing. That evening, Theresa wrote letters by lamplight in her room. One to her aunt in Ohio, her mother's sister, who she had only met twice, informing her of the family's passing. Another to the pastor back in Nebraska, thanking him for his kindness during those terrible weeks. She found the act of writing cathartic, a way to process what had happened while also looking forward. The next morning she arrived at the schoolhouse at 10 minutes before 8, determined to make a good impression. Miss Perry was already there, organizing books on shelves. Prompt, good. The older woman handed her a stack of primers. "These need to be checked for damage. Any with torn pages or broken spines set aside for repair." The work was methodical and soothing. Miss Perry proved to be exacting but fair, explaining what she wanted clearly and offering praise when Theresa did something correctly. They worked through the morning, breaking for a simple lunch of bread and cheese that Miss Perry had brought. "You mentioned teaching Sunday school," Miss Perry said as they ate in the shade of the schoolhouse. "What age children?" 5 to 10 mostly. "We would teach them Bible stories and basic moral lessons." "Did you enjoy it?" Theresa considered the question. "I did. I liked seeing the moment when something clicked for a child, when they understood a concept they had been struggling with. It felt meaningful." Miss Perry nodded approvingly. "That is exactly the right attitude for teaching. It is not about showing how much you know, but about helping others discover what they can learn." They worked until 4 o'clock, at which point Miss Perry declared they had done enough for the day. Theresa walked back to the boarding house with tired feet but a satisfied feeling in her chest. She had earned her pay today, had been useful and productive. Mrs. Crawford had heated water for washing, and Theresa scrubbed herself clean before putting on her best dress, a deep blue that she had not worn since before the fever took her family. It felt strange to wear something other than black, but she had only the 2 morning dresses and they both needed washing. At 6:30 precisely, Dalton knocked on the boarding house door. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance, his hair neatly combed and his shirt pressed. He offered his arm, and Theresa took it, very aware of Mrs. Crawford watching them leave with an approving expression. The restaurant proved to be a small establishment run by a Mexican family, the interior clean and simply decorated. The proprietor greeted Dalton by name and showed them to a table near the window. "I hope you do not mind," Dalton said as they settled into their seats. "Most of the other places are either too rough or too expensive, but the Garcia family makes the best food in town." "It is perfect," Theresa assured him, and she meant it. The smell of cooking spices and meat made her mouth water. They ordered steaks with beans and rice, and as they waited for the food, Dalton asked about her first day working with Miss Perry. Theresa found herself telling him about the careful work of checking primers and learning Miss Perry's exacting standards. "She reminds me of my mother in some ways," Theresa said. stern but caring underneath. She wants things done right, but she is willing to teach you how. That sounds like Miss Perry exactly. Dalton took a sip of his coffee. She has been teaching here for nearly 30 years. Half the adults in this town learned to read from her. Their food arrived, and it was as good as Dalton had promised. They ate and talked, the conversation flowing easily. Dalton told her stories about his work as a marshal, the occasional drama of cattle rustlers and claim jumpers, the more frequent monotony of settling disputes between neighbors. "It is not as exciting as the dime novels make it sound," he admitted with a smile. "Mostly it is paperwork and mediating arguments about property lines. But you like it." "I do. I like helping people, making sure folks can live their lives without fear. It feels important, even when it is boring." Theresa found herself studying his face as he talked, noting the crinkles around his eyes when he smiled, the earnestness in his expression. He was handsome, certainly, but more than that, he seemed genuinely good. In her experience, that was far rarer than mere good looks. "What about you?" Dalton asked. "What did you dream about doing when you were younger, before life got in the way?" No one had ever asked her that before. Theresa sat back in her chair, considering. "I used to love reading. We did not have many books, but the ones we had I read over and over. I dreamed of having a library full of books, of being able to read whatever I wanted whenever I wanted. That is a good dream. It is a foolish one. Books are expensive, and I am a working woman now. I will be lucky to afford 1 or 2 a year. Maybe." Dalton leaned forward, his eyes bright. "But Evanston has a lending library. It is small, just one room in the back of the church, but the pastor's wife runs it, and she is always happy to have new members." Theresa felt a flutter of excitement in her chest. "Really? I did not know. I will introduce you on Sunday if you like." "Do you attend services?" "I would like to. I have not been to church since." She trailed off, the unspoken words hanging between them. "Since your family passed," Dalton finished gently. "I understand, but maybe it would be good to go, not because you have to, but because you want to." "Maybe you are right." She looked down at her plate, mostly empty now. "I have been so focused on just surviving, on getting through each day, that I have not thought much about what comes after." "What comes after is living," Dalton said quietly. "Really living, not just surviving. Your family would not want you to spend the rest of your life in grief." Theresa felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. "How did you do it? After you lost your wife and child?" She saw the flash of pain cross his face, saw him take a moment to compose himself. "Honestly, I did not handle it well at first. I threw myself into my work, took every dangerous assignment, did not care much whether I lived or died. But eventually I realized that Anna would have hated that. She was always so full of life, so determined to find joy in small things. Dishonoring her memory by giving up on living seemed like the worst possible tribute to her." "I am sorry for your loss," Theresa said softly, "and I am sorry for yours." He reached across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, she placed her hand in his. His palm was warm and calloused, strong and steady. "But we are both still here, Theresa. We both get to decide what comes next." They sat like that for a long moment, hands joined across the table, two people marked by loss finding something like hope in each other's presence. Eventually the proprietor came by to clear their plates, and they reluctantly separated. Dalton walked her back to the boarding house as the last light faded from the sky. The air had finally cooled, and somewhere a dog barked. They paused on the porch, neither quite ready for the evening to end. "Thank you for supper," Theresa said, "and for the conversation. It has been a long time since I talked to someone who understood. Thank you for saying yes." Dalton smiled at her, that warm, genuine smile that made her stomach flutter. "Would you allow me to call on you again?" I would like that very much. He took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture that was both chaste and intimate. Good night, Theresa. Good night, Dalton. She watched him walk away into the darkness before going inside, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched her skin. Mrs. Crawford was in the parlor again, pretending to read but clearly waiting up. Had a good evening, dear. Yes, very good. Theresa could not quite keep the smile from her face. He is a good man, Mrs. Crawford repeated her earlier assessment, and you are a good woman. Sometimes good people deserve to find each other. Theresa climbed the stairs to her room, her heart feeling lighter than it had in months. She prepared for bed and lay in the darkness, thinking about Dalton's words. What comes after is living, really living. Perhaps it was time to try. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. Theresa worked at the schoolhouse from 8 to 4, learning the intricacies of lesson planning and classroom management from Miss Perry. In the evenings, she would either help Mrs. Crawford around the boarding house or spend time with Dalton. He took her to the lending library as promised, where she met the pastor's wife and checked out her first book in months. They went on walks together, exploring the outskirts of Evanston, and attended church on Sundays. Theresa found herself looking forward to seeing him, found herself thinking about him during idle moments. The way he laughed, the care with which he listened when she talked, the strength in his hands and the gentleness in his eyes. She was falling for him, she realized one evening as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the sunset. The realization should have frightened her, coming so soon after her loss, but instead it felt right. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked, noticing her thoughtful expression. "You," she answered honestly. He turned to look at her fully, and she could see her own feelings reflected in his face. "I think about you too, more than I probably should." "Why should not you?" "Because you are still grieving, and I do not want to rush you into anything you are not ready for. I care about you too much to be careless with your heart." Theresa reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "I am grieving, yes. I will probably grieve my family for the rest of my life in some way. But that does not mean I cannot also feel other things, joy and hope and whatever this is between us." "And what do you think this is?" His voice was low, intimate. "I think it is the beginning of something important." She met his eyes steadily. "I think you are the best thing that has happened to me in a very long time, Dalton Nichols." He lifted their joined hands and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, then to her palm, then to the inside of her wrist. Each touch sent shivers through her. "You are the best thing that has happened to me too, Theresa Hartwell. I was not looking for this, was not looking for anyone, and then there you were, looking lost and heartbroken, and I just knew." "Knew what?" "That you were going to matter, that you already mattered." He cupped her face with his free hand, his thumb stroking her cheek. "May I kiss you?" In answer, Theresa leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers softly, carefully, a question and an answer all at once. The kiss was sweet and gentle, full of promise and possibility. When they pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Theresa felt like something fundamental had shifted in the world. "I am courting you," Dalton announced, a smile playing at his lips. "Officially and properly. I wanted to be clear about my intentions." "I would like that," Theresa said, her own smile matching his. "Very much." They sat together in the gathering darkness, hands linked, shoulders touching, two people learning to hope again. Mrs. Crawford appeared in the doorway eventually, clearing her throat meaningfully. "It is getting late, Miss Hartwell. Best come inside before the neighbors start talking." Theresa laughed, the sound feeling strange and wonderful after so much grief. "Yes, Mrs. Crawford." Dalton stood, helping her to her feet. "I will see you tomorrow, she confirmed. That night, Theresa dreamed of her mother for the first time since the funeral. In the dream, They were in their old kitchen, and her mother was teaching her to make bread as she had when Theresa was a girl. But instead of the lesson she remembered, her mother stopped kneading and looked at her directly. "You deserve to be happy," her mother said in the dream. "Do not let grief steal your whole life from you, Theresa. We are gone, but you are still here, live for all of us." Theresa woke with tears on her cheeks, but also a sense of peace. She took it as the blessing it felt like, permission from the part of her mind that still needed permission to move forward. August turned to September, and the students began returning to the schoolhouse. Theresa found she enjoyed working with the children, the younger ones who needed help with their letters and numbers. Miss Perry proved to be an excellent teacher, and Theresa learned as much from watching her as she had from any formal education. Dalton continued to court her properly, with walks and suppers and church socials. They talked about everything, their pasts and their hopes for the future, the big questions and the small daily details. Theresa learned that he liked his coffee black, that he had a scar on his shoulder from a bullet wound he had gotten while working as a scout, that he sang quietly to himself when he thought no one was listening. He learned that she was terrible at arithmetic but loved geography, that she could sew nearly invisible stitches, that thunderstorms made her anxious because the fever had started during a storm. In October, as the aspens turned gold on the mountains around Evanston, Dalton invited Theresa on a picnic. They rode out of town on borrowed horses, Theresa riding side saddle on a gentle mare while Dalton led the way on his own sturdy gelding. He brought them to a meadow with a view of the mountains, where the grass was still green and a creek burbled nearby. They spread a blanket and ate the lunch Mrs. Crawford had packed for them, fried chicken and biscuits and apple pie. The autumn air was crisp and clear, the sky an impossible blue. "I love it here," Theresa said, lying back on the blanket to watch clouds drift past. "It is so peaceful." Dalton lay beside her, propped on one elbow to look down at her face. "I wanted to bring you somewhere special. You did. This is perfect." She reached up to touch his face, tracing the line of his jaw. "You are perfect." "I am far from perfect," he said with a laugh, "but I am perfect for you, I think, I hope." "You are." She pulled him down for a kiss, deeper than their previous chaste touches, and felt his arms come around her. They kissed until they were both breathless, until Dalton pulled back with visible effort. "We should stop," he said, his voice rough. "I want to do this right, want to honor you properly." Theresa sat up, straightening her hair and dress, feeling flushed and happy. "I know, you are right." He took her hand, looking suddenly nervous. "Theresa, I know it has only been a few months since we met. I know that by most standards we should wait longer, be more cautious. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this, of us." Her heart began to pound. "Dalton." "I love you," he said simply. "I love your strength and your kindness and your courage. I love the way you throw yourself into helping those children learn, the way you talk about books like they are old friends, the way you laugh when something genuinely amuses you. I love that you understand loss without letting it define you. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple gold band with a small ruby. "This was my grandmother's ring. My mother gave it to me before I left Texas, said to save it for someone special. Theresa Hartwell, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears streamed down Theresa's face, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he was kissing her again, and she was kissing him back, both of them laughing and crying at the same time. "I love you too," she said when they finally pulled apart. "I think I started falling in love with you that first day when you said I had not lost you. You gave me hope when I thought I had none left." They stayed in the meadow until the sun began to set, making plans for their future. They decided on a November wedding, small and simple. Theresa would continue working at the schoolhouse after they married, and they would live in the small house Dalton owned on the edge of town. When they returned to Evanston, they went straight to Mrs. Crawford to share the news. The landlady took one look at Theresa's beaming face and the ring on her finger and let out a whoop of joy. "I knew it," she crowed. "I knew from that very first day. Oh, this is wonderful news." The next few weeks passed in a flurry of preparations. Theresa wrote to her aunt in Ohio with the news and received a warm letter back with congratulations and a small monetary gift. Miss Perry, upon hearing about the engagement, surprised Theresa by offering to make her wedding dress. "I used to be quite the seamstress," the older woman explained. "It has been years since I made anything so fine, but I remember how. It would be my gift to you." Theresa was deeply touched. In the months since arriving in Evanston, Miss Perry had become more than just an employer. She was a mentor and friend, someone who understood loss and resilience. The dress proved to be beautiful, made of cream-colored silk that Miss Perry had been saving for years. It was simple but elegant, with long sleeves and a high neck appropriate for a modest wedding. When Theresa tried it on for the final fitting, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. "You look beautiful," Miss Perry said, and there was genuine warmth in her usually stern voice. "Dalton is a lucky man." "I think I am the lucky one," Theresa replied softly. The wedding took place on a crisp November morning at the church in Evanston. The pastor performed the ceremony with Mrs. Crawford and the sheriff standing as witnesses. Miss Perry attended, along with several of the other teachers and townspeople who had befriended Theresa in her months there. Theresa walked down the aisle alone, having no father to give her away, but she did not feel alone. She could almost feel her family's presence, her mother's approval and her father's blessing and Samuel's excitement. And waiting for her at the altar was Dalton, looking handsome in a new suit, his eyes full of love and promise. They spoke their vows in clear, strong voices, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Dalton kissed her with such tenderness that Theresa felt her heart might burst from happiness. The small reception at the boarding house was filled with laughter and good food. Mrs. Crawford had outdone herself with the wedding cake, and someone produced a fiddle for dancing. Dalton swept Theresa around the cleared parlor floor, both of them grinning like fools. As the sun set on their wedding day, Dalton took Theresa home to the house they would now share. It was a modest structure, 2 bedrooms and a main room with a kitchen area, but Theresa loved it immediately. Dalton had clearly worked hard to make it welcoming, with fresh curtains at the windows and wildflowers in a jar on the table. "Welcome home, Mrs. Nichols," he said, lifting her over the threshold. "Mrs. Nichols." Theresa liked the sound of that, liked the way it represented a new beginning while honoring the woman she had been. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, both of them nervous but eager. Dalton was patient and gentle, making sure Theresa felt safe and loved. Afterward they lay tangled together in the bed, Theresa's head on Dalton's chest as his fingers traced patterns on her shoulder. "Are you happy?" he asked quietly. "Happier than I thought I could ever be again," she answered truthfully. "When I came to Evanston, I thought my life was over. I thought I would just exist, going through the motions. But you showed me that I could live again, really live. You gave me that gift." "You gave it to yourself," Dalton corrected. "I just offered my hand. You were the one brave enough to take it." Theresa lifted her head to kiss him. "We saved each other, I think." "Yeah, I think we did." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, two hearts that had known loss learning to beat together in hope. The winter of their first year of marriage was cold but joyful. Theresa continued teaching at the schoolhouse, though she now came home each evening to a husband and a home of her own. They established routines and traditions, small rituals that made their house a home. Dalton would always kiss her goodbye in the morning before heading to the marshal's office. Theresa would have coffee waiting when he came home for lunch. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Theresa reading aloud while Dalton whittled or mended tack. Christmas came, their first as a married couple, and they exchanged simple gifts. Dalton gave Theresa a new book, a volume of Tennyson's poetry that she had mentioned wanting. Theresa gave him a warm woolen scarf she had knitted in secret, working on it during her lunch breaks at the schoolhouse. In January, Theresa realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another month to be sure before telling Dalton, remembering what Mrs. Crawford had said about him losing his first wife and child to childbirth. When she finally told him in early February, sitting together after supper, she saw fear and joy war in his expression. "Are you certain?" he asked, his hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "As certain as I can be. I thought you should know right away in case." She could not quite finish the sentence. Dalton pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly. "Nothing is going to happen to you. I will not let it." "You cannot promise that," Theresa said softly, her own fears surfacing. "Childbirth is dangerous. Women die. Not you, not this time." He pulled back to look at her face, his expression fierce. "We are going to get you the best care available. I will send for a doctor from Salt Lake City if I have to. You are going to be fine, and our baby is going to be fine." His certainty was comforting, even if Theresa knew it was not entirely rational. But she let herself believe it, let herself be excited about the new life growing inside her. Over the next months, as winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, Theresa's belly swelled. She continued working at the schoolhouse until May, when Miss Perry insisted she stop and rest. Dalton hovered nervously, bringing her anything she wanted, making sure she was comfortable. In late August, as the heat of summer began to wane, Theresa's labor began. Mrs. Crawford came to help along with the town's midwife, a capable woman named Sarah Chen, whose own mother had been Chinese and father a railroad worker. Dalton paced anxiously in the main room while Theresa labored in their bedroom. The birth was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Theresa clung to Mrs. Crawford's hand, breathing through the pain, thinking about her mother and how she must have done this 3 times. When the baby finally came with the dawn, its first cry strong and healthy, Theresa wept with relief and joy. "A boy," Sarah announced, cleaning the baby and wrapping him in a soft blanket. "A healthy baby boy." Dalton was allowed in then, and his face when he saw his son was something Theresa would never forget. Wonder and love and relief all mixed together. "He is perfect," Dalton whispered, carefully taking the baby in his arms. "Just perfect." They named him Samuel after Theresa's brother, with Dalton's father's name, James, as his middle name. Samuel James Nichols, born August 28, 1879, with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. Those first weeks of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful. Samuel was a good baby, nursing well and sleeping in stretches long enough that Theresa could rest. Dalton proved to be a devoted father, getting up in the night to bring the baby to Theresa for feeding, changing diapers without complaint, singing softly to his son. One evening when Samuel was about 6 weeks old, Theresa woke from a nap to find Dalton sitting in the rocking chair with the baby, both of them dozing in the last light of day. The sight filled her with such overwhelming love that she had to press her hand to her chest. This was her family now. not a replacement for the one she had lost, but something new and precious in its own right. She thought about her parents and brother, about how they would have loved to meet little Samuel, and she felt sad but also grateful. Grateful that she had survived her grief, that she had been brave enough to take the hand Dalton offered that first day in Evanston, that she had allowed herself to love again. Dalton's eyes opened and he smiled at her. "Hey, good nap, the best." She came to sit at his feet, resting her head against his knee while looking up at their son. "I love you both so much. We love you too." He reached down to stroke her hair. "So much." The months turned into years and their family grew. When Samuel was 2, Theresa gave birth to a daughter they named Clara Anna, after Dalton's mother and his first wife. Theresa had suggested Anna's name herself, wanting to honor the woman who had come before her, wanting their daughter to carry that legacy of love. Dalton had wept when she suggested it, holding her and telling her how much it meant to him. "You are an extraordinary woman, Theresa Nichols." "I learned from extraordinary people," she replied. Clara proved to be a spirited child, full of energy and curiosity, keeping both parents on their toes. 2 years after that, another son arrived, healthy and loud, whom they named Thomas after Theresa's father. Their house, which had once seemed so spacious, filled with the noise and mess and joy of children. Theresa eventually stopped teaching at the schoolhouse when their third child was born, though she missed the work. Miss Perry retired that same year, and the school board asked Theresa if she would consider taking over when her children were older. She promised to think about it. Dalton continued his work as a deputy marshal, though as the years passed and the Wild West began to tame, his work became more administrative and less dangerous. He was grateful for that, wanting to be around to watch his children grow up. They built a good life together in Evanston. They made friends, became respected members of the community, watched their children learn and grow. Samuel proved to be quiet and thoughtful like his mother, always with his nose in a book. Clara was bold and adventurous, constantly climbing trees and catching frogs. Thomas was the comedian of the family, always making everyone laugh. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dalton took Theresa back to the meadow where he had proposed. They left the children with Mrs. Crawford, who was getting on in years but still spry enough to manage 3 energetic youngsters for an afternoon. The meadow looked much the same as it had that autumn day 10 years before. They spread a blanket and lay in the grass, holding hands and watching clouds drift by. "Do you ever regret it?" Dalton asked. "Marrying me so quickly, tying your life to mine?" Theresa turned to look at him, noting the gray beginning to thread through his dark hair, the lines around his eyes from years of smiling. "Not for a single second." "You are the best decision I ever made, Dalton Nichols. Even when I leave my boots in the middle of the floor, even then," she laughed. "Though I might regret it momentarily when I trip over them in the dark." He pulled her close, kissing her with the practiced ease of long familiarity, but also with the spark that had never quite faded between them. "I love you more now than I did on our wedding day. I did not think that was possible, but it is true. I know what you mean." Every year, every moment, every shared experience just adds to it. She rested her head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Sometimes I still cannot believe I found you. That first day in Evanston, I was so lost, so certain my life was over, and then there you were." "You have not lost me," Dalton quoted his own words from that day. "And you never will. I am yours for as long as I draw breath, and probably beyond that too." They stayed in the meadow until the sun began to set, talking about their children and their hopes for the future, remembering the journey that had brought them together. When they finally rode back to town, Theresa felt full of gratitude for the life they had built. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. Mrs. Crawford passed away peacefully in her sleep when Samuel was 8, and the whole town mourned her. She left the boarding house to Theresa and Dalton in her will, saying they were the closest thing to family she had. They sold it to a young couple just starting out, using the money to add on to their house and to save for their children's future. Miss Perry lived to the remarkable age of 86, staying sharp and opinionated until the very end. When she died, she left her considerable collection of books to Theresa, knowing they would be treasured. Theresa cried as she unpacked the volumes, remembering the stern but kind woman who had given her a chance when she needed it most. Samuel grew up to become a teacher himself, following in the footsteps of his mother and the woman she had admired. Clara, spirited as ever, became a nurse, determined to help people in her own way. Thomas surprised everyone by becoming a veterinarian, his love of animals finally finding a practical outlet. Theresa and Dalton became grandparents, marveling at the way life continued, generation after generation. They grew older together, their hair turning gray, their steps becoming slower, but their love remaining constant. On a spring evening in 1910, 32 years after that first meeting in Evanston, Theresa and Dalton sat on their porch watching the sunset. They were in their 60s now, both retired, their children grown with families of their own. Theresa's hands, once so deft with a needle, were gnarled with arthritis. Dalton walked with a slight limp from an old injury that ached in cold weather. But they still sat together every evening, still held hands, still found joy in each other's company. "You remember the day we met?" Theresa asked, though she knew he did. They had told the story countless times to their children and grandchildren. Of course. "You were wearing a black dress and looked like a strong wind might blow you away. I thought you were the most beautiful, sad thing I had ever seen. I was so lost that day, so utterly lost." Dalton squeezed her hand gently. "You have not lost me." Theresa smiled at the echo of those words from so long ago. "No, I have not. You kept your promise, and I will keep on keeping it." He lifted her hand to his lips, kissing it with the same tenderness he had shown all those years ago, "for as long as the Lord gives us." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn brilliant shades of orange and pink. Theresa thought about her first family, the one she had lost to fever, and felt the familiar ache of old grief. But she also felt peace. She had honored their memory by living fully, by loving completely, by building a new family that carried forward the best parts of the old. She thought about the young woman she had been, stepping off that stagecoach with nothing but grief and a small satchel, certain her life was over. She wished she could go back and tell that woman that everything would be all right, that loss would not be the end of her story but rather a painful beginning. She had lost her first family, that was true. The grief of that loss would never entirely leave her. But she had also found love and purpose and a life worth living. She had found Dalton, her anchor in the storm, her partner in building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked, always able to read her moods. "About how lucky I am." "About how you saved me." "We saved each other," he corrected gently, as he had so many times before. "I was just going through the motions before you came along. You gave me a reason to really live again." Theresa leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady presence that had been her constant for over 3 decades. "We make a good team, Dalton Nichols. The very best team, Theresa Nichols." As the sun finally dipped below the horizon and the first stars began to appear, they rose together and went inside their home. The house was quiet now with just the two of them, so different from the years of noise and chaos when the children were young. but it was a good quiet, peaceful rather than lonely. They prepared for bed with the efficiency of long practice, Theresa braiding her silver hair while Dalton checked the doors and windows. They climbed into the bed they had shared for 32 years, and Dalton pulled her close, her back to his chest, his arm around her waist. "Good night, my love," he murmured into her hair. "Good night, my heart," she replied, lacing her fingers with his. Theresa drifted off to sleep feeling safe and loved, grateful beyond measure for the cowboy who had refused to let her stay lost, who had shown her that, even after devastating loss, joy and love could bloom again. Their story, which had started with such sorrow, had become one of hope and healing and enduring love. And in the morning, they would wake together and face another day, as they had for over 3 decades and would continue to do for all the days they had left. Two souls who had found each other in grief and built a lifetime of love, proving that even in the wildest of places and the darkest of times, the human heart could still choose hope, still choose connection, still choose to keep living and loving with everything it had. Their love story was not one of grand gestures or dramatic rescues, though it had started with both. It was a story of quiet moments and steady devotion, of showing up day after day, of choosing each other over and over again. It was a story that honored the people they had lost while celebrating the life they had found together. And it was a story that would continue, carried forward in the children and grandchildren who bore witness to what two people could build when they chose love over despair, hope over resignation, together over alone. The Nichols family would remember that their foundation was built by a grieving woman and a compassionate cowboy who met on a dusty street in Evanston, Wyoming Territory, in the summer of 1878, and decided that loss did not have to be the end of everything. It could also be a beginning.